All right. All right. Well, hi, Ilana. Good to see you.
It's good to be
Uh,
here.
this is one of our first webinars for People Leaders Club, and I'm Jeremy Pollack. I'm the founder of Pollack Peace Building Systems and the co-founder of People Leaders Club. I have with us today Dr. Ilana Redstone. I'll just give a quick bio on you, Ilana. We can kind of get started in our topic for the day. So Ilana is the founder of Diverse Perspectives Consulting and the president of the Mill Center for the Advancement of Critical Thinking. She's also the co-author of Unassailable Ideas, How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. She's a faculty fellow at Heterodox Academy and the creator of the Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes video series. She is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She has a joint PhD in demography and sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Ilana.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, so today, good to have you. Today we're talking about diversity of thought, how to respond to people that have different ideas, specifically in the workplace. But I think for workplace matters, this kind of to me this falls into two potentially broad categories. One category is more workplace relevant, more sort of mundane issues, and then larger socio-political issues that kind of filter into the workplace and that are sort of sometimes in certain workplaces very center, and then in others just kind of in the background. But I thought we maybe start with the more mundane and then kind of tackle the bigger stuff, which is your area of expertise, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think, yeah, sort of establishing sort of some of what the general guidelines are for, I think what you're saying is sort of how to resolve differences of opinion or conflicts more generally,
Yeah.
right? Things like, try and keep the conversation neutral, try and, engage with the ideas, or if you're going to criticize the ideas, not the person. Try to stay calm. Yeah, I mean, you're actually be interested in hearing your sort of thoughts on this in terms of the general conflict resolution, because I do think that there is a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
So what do you tell people in terms of the first couple of things that you would say at the top of your list?
Well, I mean, for me, like when someone says, let's say we're talking about a couple of business partners and or a couple of co-executives, and one of the partners comes to the other and says, hey, I'm thinking that we ought to be taking this company in another direction. I think we should give it to more of a technology-based platform rather than this sort of, labor-heavy manual sort of service that we've been providing, or something like that. And and this is just the other one is just, very set in his ways and doesn't think about pivoting and doesn't want, and that makes him very nervous. So there's then this conflict becomes, a thing. And so how do we respond to these ideas? Because a lot of times people respond and either they'll get defensive or they'll get dismissive,
right,
or they'll try to avoid it or something. But what I typically go through with people is, number one, it's not always that people need to get their way, that people need to feel heard. That's
right,
the sort of the first most important thing. And so how do we
right,
make someone feel heard? I'm going to listen. I'm going to do some reflective listening, making sure I heard them correctly. I'm going to actually consider the idea. I'm going to present some of the challenges I see with it. I'll open a collaborative dialogue about, okay, so here are some of the challenges I see. Have you thought about any of those? Do you have any solutions? Do you think those are important challenges? And so it's really a back and forth instead of a shutdown. It's a collaborative process, and it's important that the person who brought up the idea feels like they were heard and that the idea is actually being considered. And even if it doesn't end up that they get their way, at least the process of being heard and of collaborating on the potential shift or not maintains the relationship on some level, because that's what's important, is maintaining the trust in the relationship, even if the idea itself doesn't get come to fruition. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
No, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think it does, the part about being heard, I think that also, my understanding would be that, there's another piece of it that's not that this would entirely diffuse a heated situation, but remind it, like in the example that you gave, just kind of being aware that you share a common goal. Like no one is trying to, in that case, drive the company into the ground, for example. Like we're all trying to, we may differ on sort of how to get there, but we do have this shared goal in mind. And again, not that that makes everything else go away, but you know, yeah, everyone is sort of in it for the same thing. So I would assume that that would be a help to the extent that you can remind or help people keep that in mind, that that can be helpful sometimes.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I mean, I think that's part of that should be a critical element in what I would call like an alignment phase. So
Yeah.
let's say I'm listening to someone, I'm kind of reflecting back, hey, here's what I heard. This is what you want to do, right? Okay.
Right.
And you could say, and then you, what I would say is could I find the merit in their idea?
Yeah.
If I can't, I can ask them for it, but can I
Sure.
find it and reflect that value back and say, you know, I think we both want the same thing. We want what's best for the company. That's clear. And I do like this idea. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea what you're posing, because it can kind of take us in this direction. It can do this in a beneficial way for us. So you're giving some value and some merit to the idea, and that helps align with it. And also, I like that you're like, I'm going to mention our common goal. Right. That helps people make sure, hey, we're on the same team. We're not conflicting here. We're on the same team. We just have different ideas about how to get to the same goal.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, I know we'll get to some of the more controversial stuff in a minute, but having a common goal or having a sort of shared goal is, I know on the more controversial topics, it's enormously important. Mm-hmm. And so I think that is one area of overlap. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think they overlap a lot. That's an important piece. Is there anything that you can think of that you've dealt with in your work that's like that would be surprising to most people, you think?
That would be surprising. I mean, I think that what would be surprising, maybe two things I would say. One is that there's no part of what I'm doing where I'm trying to tell people what to think. And so sometimes I'll say, I have more questions than answers. So there's nothing in what I'm doing that suggests I'm trying to tell people what to think, or that I have, the right answers, the key to unlock the box to all the secrets and if they say the right thing, the right code, then, we unlock it. Right. So I think that's part of it. And then maybe the other one would be, I don't know if that's surprising or not, but the other one, I guess, would be, I think this is in some ways a little counterintuitive, which is that really what I'm doing in terms of fostering constructive engagement and trying to build a climate that is really sort of welcoming of constructive engagement across some pretty polarizing issues, is based in uncertainty. So one of the things, it's based in sort of a lot of the most controversial issues really come down to sort of, can somebody come at this with a different perspective and not be kind of odious moral character? And that comes down to a question of certainty. And so a lot of it is about, and that's why this is, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but that's why, I would say that things like strategies like that promote, for example, civil discourse. Civil discourse is great. Like, sure, more civil discourse, more rather than less seems like an unambiguously good thing. However, civil discourse, to even get there, you have to get at this, you have to sort of pull at this thread of uncertainty. And you have to, because in other words, civil discourse doesn't matter if you have two sides where one or the other thinks that anybody who disagrees is some kind of sinister creature, right? Like then civil discourse doesn't matter. So what I'm doing is starting even back a step and saying, like, let's figure out how to get there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, okay. So this is a good segue. Let's talk real fast. So you teach in academia, right, at the college level.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then you also have a consulting firm where you work
Yep.
with organizations.
Mhm.
Can you tell us just a little bit about that work, and then we can kind of dive into some of the topics.
Yeah, I mean, really in all of the work that I do through in my academic work, and then my non-academic work sort of takes two forms. One is through Diverse Perspectives Consulting, and then the other is through the Mill Center, which is more education focused. And so Diverse Perspectives Consulting is just me. And the Mill Center I do is an organization, is an entity at this point with two other women that I work with who are also very good in this space and very in sort of the work that we've been doing together. But I would say that what is in common with all of those things is that it's really just trying to move the conversation forward. Take sort of variations on the same conversation on all of these different fronts and move it forward. And so by this conversation, I mean, topics that touch on, touch issues of identity, fairness, intent, racism, equality, all of those sort of third rail topics, and sort of how do you move it forward? And so it's doing that in a number of different settings.
Yeah. So maybe this is I can give you some examples here, and then we can kind of chat. Because they're difficult, and we're talking about, let's say we're talking about more larger socio-political issues that are kind of coming into the workplace, and how do we interact with people that have a different opinion than ours or perspective, especially if there's that level of certainty where there's some sense that if they think differently than me, if they don't buy into this sort of thought process, then yeah, they're ignorant or they're evil or something like that, right? I mean, you could look at vaccine sort of mandates, mask mandates, look at the social justice movement, that sort of thing. I mean, so I don't know if you have any in mind off the top of your head that you've dealt with, but I certainly do, and I can throw some at you and see what you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's really about uncertainty. I mean, where I've sort of, so I can put a finer point on that. So, the three dimensions of uncertainty that I think kind of capture a lot of where things break down. One, and these are the names that I've landed on. You're not going to find them written up somewhere else. One is the settled question fallacy. So, which is essentially treating issues where we don't necessarily have clear answers, or certainly not definitive answers, and we behave and interact and communicate with one another as though we do. Like, so an example would be, I mean, you could use some of the COVID stuff maybe would fit in that category, but I mean, an easy example would be, the relationship between sex and gender. Like, do we know everything that there is to know about how sex and gender, like the extent to which gender is socially constructed versus biological, right? Like, do we know everything? And obviously we don't. So that would be, there are lots of examples like that. Can I
ask you a question? So that's a really important and sort of prevalent fallacy. And I wonder, when people are in a state where they feel very certain about something that I might think is not very certain, so like for sex, gender, or for the efficacy of vaccines or efficacy of treatments to COVID or something like that, and you say, well, the data is nuanced, or the data is not all in, or the data is kind of, and they don't much care about the data because this is how they feel and they know this, or they've got some other sets of data that they're looking at and kind of not looking at other kinds of data, and they only want to focus on certain types of data. It's like, I'm certain. If you're not certain, then you're not in the game.
Yeah.
So can you walk someone back from certainty?
I think that, so the COVID, I mean, in some ways, I think COVID is almost a harder example, because COVID, it's hard to separate where we are now with COVID and controversies around COVID from the past, I guess 2 years at this point. And by that, I mean, it's hard to look at just in a vacuum, kind of where we are now, and say, well, we're going to forget about, the contradictory information on masks that came out, and about, do masks work? Do they not work? Do they, should you do cloth masks work? Do they not work? Should you quarantine for this many days or this, like all of this stuff? And what that, I mean, actually that's its own form of the settled question fallacy, right? But what that, oh yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing about, sort of lab leak hypothesis and whatever else, but what that did, and having to walk those back in a public, presenting those questions as though they had certain definitive answers, and then having to walk it back, and what that did to public trust, and frankly, understandably so, and decouple that from where we are now. I think it's all so completely intertwined, but I think that, I think so part of, okay, so let me give you a different example just to try and illustrate a point with the settled question fallacy. So someone could say, and I've had, I've had this discussion with people. So they'll say, well, hey, your settled question fallacy. Well, everyone loves the example of the flat earthers, right? So, well, why should, does that mean, could someone, or, for example, that we should be, so either the flat earther example, well, you could take what you're saying about the settled question fallacy and use it to argue that we should have a flat earther teaching in the geography department. Or, people will use these, they'll say, with respect to evolution, they'll say, well, you could take that settled question fallacy and you could use it as an argument to teach creationism in schools. And
it's almost like a gaslighting argument.
Right. It's almost right. And it's sort of like, well, if then everything is sort of up in the air.
Yeah.
And I think that the answer to that is, so first of all, I think those are fair points to raise. But I think that the answer to that is that it doesn't mean that everything is a coin toss. I think what it means is that, for example, when you really are ready to acknowledge uncertainty, like in most of what we know is uncertain. I mean, even historical facts to some small degree are uncertain. Like, okay, so the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. I wasn't there. I mean, I'm perfectly happy to believe, I have no doubt that it was, but I mean, if you're going to say I can only be certain about things that I can experience with the five senses, then it does leave a lot of uncertainty. I'm not suggesting that we should use that as a litmus test. Yeah. I'm just saying, like, that would be an extreme view. But I think if you go back to the evolution and the flat earther example, I think what it does is it tells you, I think it does have implications for how you respond to people. It's not an argument to say we should have a geography class taught by flat earthers, or we should be teaching creationism in schools. I don't think it's an argument for that. I think it does have implications for how you respond to somebody who says that that's what they believe should happen. Right. Not necessarily laughing them out of the room, like not necessarily like, not treating the argument or the position with perhaps as much disdain as we might otherwise do. And so it does have, and I don't even know, sometimes I get uncomfortable with those things, but I don't know how else if you're going to acknowledge uncertainty, then you can't start drawing kind of arbitrary lines. Well, okay, yes, about this, but not about this. And it's also, it's not this, I guess the other thing that I would say that it's not a declaration of it's not a statement that's intended to say, well, everything is relative and there's no truth and there's right that going sort of down this road. It's really just saying, look, there's a lot that we don't know. Yeah. And knowledge changes and it shifts, and we should be prepared for that. It's not saying that every opinion is equally valid or right. It's none of that, but it is sort of an honest, a kind of an intellect, or aspirationally anyway, an intellectually honest way of engaging with what we know and understand about the world. But can I mention the other two before I forget? Yeah. So that's the settled question fallacy, and they're all really related, but they're not, and there's a lot of overlap between them. The second one would be the fallacy of known intent, which is pretty self-explanatory. Yeah. And then the third one is the fallacy of equal knowledge. And you actually sort of alluded to this in the beginning in your early remarks, where you said, we think somebody who agrees with us is just, or sorry, who disagrees is just ignorant, et cetera. So a lot of times what underlies that is the idea. So the fallacy of equal knowledge is really this idea that if the other person just knew what I knew, and you could say no in a broad sense, knew both in terms of facts and also in terms of had the same experiences that I have, then they would think what I think. And what my point is, this is a fallacy. I mean, and if you, and I'll tell you why, and if there's any doubt, let me put it this way. If everybody had the same information, would we all agree? Right? If we all had the same information, right? And so the answer, when you put it that way, it's sort of obviously no. And that is also, again, I feel like it sort of comes wrapped in all these caveats, but like the caveat there would be, that does not mean that information is useless, or that, we shouldn't be listening to follow, that information doesn't have importance and that we don't need more information. More information is better. All of those things are still true. It's simply a recognition that on many of these issues, these most controversial issues, even if we had the same information, you are still not going to get agreement. And I think that that is something that I think that it is very frequently overlooked.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, when you're talking about these three fallacies, and they're very important, it seems like, I mean, it's very parallel with a basic concept in conflict resolution, which is the concept of curiosity, of remaining curious. So like if I'm totally certain, I don't.
I'm sorry,
leave
I'm
no
pushing
room.
my cat away is what I'm doing.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah, she's gonna hold on. Put her on the floor.
Oh, there she is. You leave no room for curiosity when you're completely certain. And so I like, I mean, even if you, and it doesn't, and I like what you're saying, there's a caveat. I was like, it doesn't mean that you need to change your beliefs in some way.
No.
Just because you admit that you're not absolutely certain about certain things. I believe a whole lot of things that I'm not certain about because those beliefs work for me. And I think that, and in terms of believing them, they work for my life, and they align with my value system. And that's another thing that I think you're alluding to. I think at least in the equal knowledge thing is, okay, we all have the same knowledge, let's say. We all know exactly the same thing, and we all have similar experiences, but we don't agree on, the interpretation of those things or something like that, or on what to do about them. And that comes down to maybe a difference in values of what I value more than what you value or something. And is my value system worse or better than yours, and who's to say? And so I think people get stuck in these moral high grounds about who's better or worse, or whose values are more moral or ethical or something like that. Is that
And I mean,
that's wrapped up in there?
Right. And it doesn't mean that there aren't sort of better or worse decisions or better or worse plans of action. It doesn't mean any of that. This is about, so I mean, one of the distinctions that I'll sometimes make when I'm talking to groups is, what I'm really focused on, and this kind of aligns, I think, with your work, Jeremy, which is like, so there's sort of a realm of policy and decision making, right? Like in, ultimately in an organization or in a school district or whatever, like decisions have to get made, hiring policies get made, and decisions about, criteria to use for evaluation get made, curriculums get adopted or they don't get adopted. There are better or worse decisions to do on all of those things. And there are clearly better or worse ways to communicate those decisions to people. What I'm really focused on, though, is how do we engage with one another, right? Like, so the policy stuff, that's separate. And there's obviously a lot of overlap, and I've worked with organizations on that as well. But most of what I'm doing is focusing on the relationships and sort of like, how do we get the culture, the climate to really be a space where we can have more constructive engagement with one another and maintain those relationships. And how do we do that? And so, so that's kind of, does that make sense?
Yeah, let me throw a scenario at you.
Yeah.
That I've dealt with. It's tricky. It's really tricky. Yeah. Okay. So in the last probably 12 months, I've had maybe 3 clients. And when I say clients, I'm working with senior level executives, either the CEO or a couple of the executives. And they've had an initiative, or at least they've attempted to launch an initiative around anti-racism. Okay. And I won't give you too many of the details up front because we can talk about that in a sec, but basically the part that they wanted my perspective on is they're not getting a lot of engagement. They're getting some people that are it's a little bit of pushback or just complete disengagement, including senior level executives, for instance, like other executives going, I'm not going to participate. I've got too much to do and this and that, because they're having, you know, they might be having like different trainings on it or different, you know, group dialogues or something on it. In a couple of cases, they've reported that they've seen lower engagement from people of color than from white people in these sorts of things. And they're wondering why. I mean, shouldn't they be serving them? And in all these cases, the senior level executives are all white. Okay. So the question then becomes, in these dialogues, what if someone has a difference of opinion about this whole approach that we're taking, or the idea that this is an important initiative or something like that? How could someone like that feel comfortable to speak up in this type of setting? You know, even if maybe there's multiple people that feel that this isn't quite the right approach, or that this isn't quite the right thing to be doing, or something like that. Like how do we create an environment where we get that feedback, or we can have those kinds of conversations? And it's like, for me, it's like, well, that's a very tough thing, because you sort of set out ready to have this sort of oriented conversation around this topic. And so it's almost like an assumption that we're doing the right thing here. So it's hard for people to speak up that feel like, you know, that this isn't quite either the right general thing to be talking about at work, or it's just not the right approach on this topic, or something like that. So anyway, that was something that's come up a few times in the last year, of like, you know, how do we create an environment where it's okay to push back, or to challenge, or to talk about things that aren't aligned with the assumptions we're making based on this approach.
I mean, I guess, you know, not knowing anything about the organization other than, you know, what you've just said for the last 120 seconds. You know, I think that, I guess I would first want to know, what was their goal in adopting this, you know, initiative? Like, what were they trying to do?
That's a good question.
What are they trying to do? And, you know, and I would also say, you know, there's a big difference between an anti-racist initiative, capital A, capital R, and an anti-racist sort of little a, little r, where the one is sort of the broader movement, and the other one is more sort of the literal meaning of the word. And if you're saying like the literal meaning of the word, like we want, you know, an environment, I mean, let's use synonyms. We want an environment in our workplace that is opposed to racism, in the sense of little a, little r, anti-racism. Well, really, I would imagine most of your employees will get behind that, right? Like nobody, because what's the alternative? Well, I think we need more racism. I mean, like, right. Like this is I mean, maybe there are some, you know, exceptions to that, but I think in most cases, rightly so, most employees would get behind that. When it comes to the movement, which is my guess, if I had to guess, that's probably more what these situations, what they were trying to do. Now you're talking about, and if you're talking about viewpoint diversity, so in that movement is inherently the idea you can't, that there are no valid other ways to see the world. It is a closed, it is a closed circuit. And so in the following ways, for example, that movement, and this is sort of a la Ibram Kendi, or, you know, the ideas of colorblind racism, all this stuff, what's embedded in all of that is the idea that, for example, if you don't see questions, problems, social problems, issues, whatever, through the lens of race, then that is evidence of racism. And, or if you know, sort of kind of push back on that, if you're questioning it or whatever, regardless of what your motives are, that is evidence, that is in fact evidence of racism. Okay, well, so if that's what you're doing, whether it's intentional or not, if that's what you're doing, that is, you can't also then say, well, we really want to welcome a diversity of perspectives. Right. Like now you're sending a completely contradictory message that no one is going to understand. The other thing would be, you know, the other thing with the anti-racism is that, you know, you either kind of line up behind the positions that are endorsed by that movement. So for example, affirmative action being one of the main ones, I'm not endorsing or condemning this position, but if you're going to say that anyone who is opposed to this is by definition racist, which is also largely what's implied by the sort of more formal movement, then that's fine. You can do that, but you can't, if you're going to do that and say, well, I don't understand, like, why won't people voice, why won't people talk, or why do people feel uncomfortable voicing alternative opinions? Like, now you've sent totally contradictory messages to your employees, where an alternative would be something like, look, of course we want a climate, a culture where everybody is treated fairly, where people are respected, where people are treated with dignity, where there's open communication, right? This is why I think, going back to what you said initially about, I think what we both said about a goal, that's why in this work, having a goal is really, really important.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What is the goal? What are you trying to create? And it gives you something to circle back to when you're faced with these kinds of questions. But that's sort of the conversation. If I were talking to that CEO, that's where I would start.
Yeah, in all of these situations, I asked that. Why did you start this? What was the goal, and what was the problem? And it was very interesting because none of them had a clear answer. They didn't do any kind of polling or surveying or anything to discover if there's a problem and what the goal should be. So when I kind of pressed a little bit more and let's explore this. What do you think the goal should be with something like this? And really, it comes down to, I want everyone to feel they belong here. I want everyone to feel included. And I said, okay, are you sure that this approach is the right way to get everyone to feel included? And then, no, I'm not sure, but this is what's, this is kind of like the thing, is the trend, right? And so in one situation, we worked out a different approach, which was all about inclusivity and helping people voice things in different ways. But it didn't have to do with that particular lens, because that lens did make anyone that didn't feel like they could get on board with it or talk, or challenge it in any way. And so it wasn't inclusive. It was just like, it was ideological at some point,
Right.
And that's what I see too with, in some instances with, like, vaccine mandates or mask mandates is starting to wane a little bit, but in different cases, hey, we want to come back into the office. Oh, hey, we don't want to come back into the office. And then, well, who gets to come back and who doesn't? And how are those decisions being made? And so there's all these decisions being made from top down without including voices from different people about, like, well, what should we be doing? Why should we be doing it? What are the goals here, et cetera? Right. So to me, it usually boils down to getting more voices included and giving input into how these processes are developed.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, any obviously diversity of thought is important. I think diversity of viewpoint is important, and there's plenty of research to show how that's important. I wonder if there's a threshold, like a tipping point, where it starts to get, you can get too much into, like, it's okay, now we're kind of we're going off the rails here because there's too many what's the metaphor? Too many cooks in the kitchen, or just too many people with ideas. Yeah. Do you see that at all?
I haven't seen that there have been too many. The question that I get more often is like, well, what about the sort of, what about people will say, well, what about the Nazis? Like, do they fit in, this sort of, Godwin's law. But, so the too many cooks in the kitchen, I'm not sure I've ever seen that be an issue. I think that my sense is that on many of the most salient issues, there's probably convergence that happens, a fair amount of convergence that happens. In other words, like, let's say you have, 25 people, I'd be on a whatever issue, pick your issue. I don't think you're going to get 25 totally different opinions.
Yeah.
Like, I think this is just not how, it's not
two or three.
Right. They're going to sort of glom together on, a couple. And so I've not seen that, the too many cooks in the kitchen problem. I have gotten the question of, sort of, well, what does that mean? Where are the limits? And, and
how do you determine the limits? That's a good question, I guess.
Well, I don't. So that's the short answer is I say, okay, that's my cue to leave. No,
Yeah.
no, I think that, I mean, that the limits, again, the Nazi example is always sort of, I mean, no one wants the Nazis, right? Like, so that's sort of
Right.
the easy example, but I think everything else has to be part of a conversation. I
Mm.
think it has to be a conversation. And I think that's why you have to have this goal, right? You have to have a clearly articulated goal,
Yeah.
vision, value statement, or whatever, because I'll give you an example. So let's say, for instance, that your goal is, you want a climate or culture with open communication and, on a wide range of issues. And then somebody says, well, at some point, let's say there's some water cooler conversation and somebody says, well, again, I'm just channeling an argument. I think that trans women shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's category sports. And then somebody says, well, that's offensive. And so is that a threat to the trans community, or is that just an opinion? It's probably both. Yeah. But the only thing that's going to help you figure out how you get out of that is that goal that you've articulated.
Mm.
That is the only thing
that's like your shining, that's your beacon,
it's your
that's
North
your map.
Star.
Yeah.
It's your North Star. I mean, it is, because anything else, you're going to constantly, especially in this climate, you're going to be pulled back into whatever direction you were in before, right?
Yeah.
Which is oftentimes in this climate, one that tends to be very, leans toward wanting to protect people. Not that protecting people is bad. I mean, just to be clear, like nobody wants a workplace culture where people are just free to run roughshod over everybody else's feelings, right? Like nobody wants this, but it's always but I think where people get into trouble is kind of an unwillingness, either an inability or an unwillingness to recognize that, look, there are certain places where these things are going to conflict. These values are going to conflict. And that's where the rubber meets the road. And what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And the only way to answer that is based on, well, what are you trying to, I mean, in the language of the economists, what are you trying to optimize for? What is the culture you're trying to build?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, because I'm thinking, you don't want that extreme where everybody's willing to just run roughshod over each other. And I don't care what I say impacts anybody. Okay, you don't want that. But nobody also wants where everybody's walking on eggshells. Nobody's willing to talk about anything because they're not sure what's going to offend anyone. And the goal is always moving. What's going to offend someone today is what's not going to offend someone today is going to offend someone tomorrow. So that's a really tough place to be too. So I guess, again.
And there's And I mean,
what do we
the
want
other
the
thing
culture
is
to
that,
be?
right. And the other thing is that, whatever trainer you bring in, whether it's you, whether it's me, whether it's anybody else, no one is going to be able to anticipate every possible scenario that's going to arise. Like no one's going to be able to hand you or anybody else a script and say, okay, well, if this, then like algorithmically sort of laid out, if this, then this, if this, then this. And so really it is a shift in the mindset. It's a shift in what are we trying to do here and what gets in the way and how do we get there? And constantly reorienting and sort of recalibrating towards that. And I think going back to your original question of like, what's too far? I think it has to be a conversation.
Yeah.
I think it has to be you should be having that conversation.
Yeah. So, I mean, and so I think, one thing that I talk about sometimes is putting the relationship before the position or before the solution. I mean, if that's my goal, if I want an ongoing relationship with this person, with this workforce, with the staff, if that's important to me, then I have to put that as a priority. And if the relationship is a priority, then it really is about having the conversation, listening, collaborating, talking about it. Even if it's something that right off the bat, I just hear and I go, that sounds crazy to me. If the relationship's important, what's important to do is not to just dismiss it and go, that's crazy, that's bullshit. It's important to instead, okay, let's talk about that. That's that's an interesting idea. Let's talk about it. Even in the case, and I wonder how you might think about this is like, let's say you're in Is there a place at a college, like in a college geography, or what, I don't know what the would be a
You talking about the flat earther
yeah,
example?
the flat with the geography, would that be
Yeah,
like a
sure.
geography course, let's say, and a teacher is a very open-minded teacher, maybe a little wacky or something, and they want to present open earth not as the thing that it's true, but just this is one idea that some people have, and here's some of the evidence that they use. Now, maybe there's no evidence, I don't know, but here's some
Right.
of the reasoning they have for it. It's just here's an idea,
I actually
and
think that would be
so
kind of interesting, right? Like, and
yeah,
again, so let's say you have a 15-week course on geography, right?
right,
Like, I'm not suggesting that you spend 7 weeks on this,
right.
but do you spend, I don't know, 10 minutes in it or 15 minutes in one class on it? I don't, probably, why not?
Just to let, yeah,
Right,
here's what people are thinking out there. I mean, is it I mean, you get into this idea where certain thoughts are dangerous. Is it
right.
dangerous to present something as an idea? And unfortunately, I think this is where we get into trouble, especially in academia these days, and now in workplaces as well, where we have these particular ideas or perspectives or ideologies, and instead of presenting them as here's one way people think about this, and then here's another way, instead of doing that, this we take this ideology and we say this is the way to think. This is the
Right.
only way to think, and it has to permeate all the lessons that we now have.
I think this is why you need a goal. I mean, I think the only way around this is to figure out what the goal is. Like, what are you
Mm-hmm.
trying to build? What are you
That's
trying to do? And it will, you can, and there's just, and if you do that, then, I mean, in an ideal world, right, a natural system of sort of checks and balances will emerge, in the sense that you will have a critical mass of people who will be kind of on board with this goal and say, okay, and right, as conversations unfold, all right, well, we said we wanted this thing over there. If we make this decision, is it going to bring us further or closer to this thing that we agreed that we wanted? Right. And that's true
yeah.
for schools. That's true for organizations. That's right. Corporations. That's true across the board.
So yeah, so coming up with the North Star, with the goal,
Yeah.
really important, and that can be a number of goals that create this idea for the culture of
Mhm.
whatever organization, whatever kind of system we're in. So in a workplace, having some collaborative initiatives to come up with, our what are our culture goals, what is the kind
Yeah.
of culture we want, and then creating, if you need to create workshops or trainings or just general,
Yeah.
sort of dialogues around that. Um,
I mean, here's
yeah.
another extreme example. Like, if you work with an organization and they said, okay, and you said, what is your goal? And they said, all right, well, we want to create a culture where no one ever feels offended or hurt.
Mm,
I mean, that would,
good
I
luck.
mean, that's fine. Like, you can create that
Yeah.
as a goal. I mean, that has a very specific set of implications, right?
Mm,
Like, that is, okay, so that's your goal. That's, I mean, it wouldn't be what I would choose, but if that's your goal, then fine, then you will orient toward that goal. And the implications are, that anybody claims that something is offensive, then that becomes the end of the story. But
yeah.
what's I think is hard for employees, or in terms of contradictory messages, is that saying we want everyone to feel included, and then behaving in a way that says, okay, but here are all the different things that are sort of,
Acceptable
implicitly or
or
explicitly, right, like sort of taken off the table. And we don't really talk about those, and we don't talk about why they're off the table and what the implicate and how these messages are contradictory. And there's all this subtext that's going around that is just not helpful.
yeah, that's really important. So making sure the goal is very clear and making sure
Yeah.
it's communicating clearly to the workforce so that everyone understands this is the kind of culture we're in. You can make a decision whether to stay or leave, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
and then
Well,
they
I
can put
mean,
their
yeah. I mean,
yeah,
yeah. And you could, I mean, you could orient your hiring around that. I mean, yeah, there are all
right.
kinds of things you could do depending on how you wanted to go with it. But I think a lot of it ultimately is sort of figuring out what you're trying to do. And then as situations arrive, again, which no one is going to be able to anticipate, every situation as they
Yeah.
arise. How do you want to handle it? Like, how, again, I would go back to
What's
sort of
the
the
process?
uncertainty, right, in terms of how we interact, but then the uncertainty is more about the three principles. That's more about, okay, once you've said that you want to create a culture that sort of creates a space for a diversity of opinions or viewpoints or whatever, conditional on that being your goal or part of your goal, the uncertainty, those principles around uncertainty are how to help you get there. Right. If you tell me that, again, you want to just do your best to create an environment where nobody ever feels offended, then the principles of uncertainty don't really matter, because now you're oriented in a very different direction. So it's only if your goal, if your culture you're trying to build is something, there's about a piece about it with viewpoint diversity or open communication, then these principles will help you build that, and I can work with organizations on that, but these principles will help you create that.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just, anybody that's in the attendees area, please, if you have any questions, please throw them into the chat or the Q&A section right now, because we'll probably wrap up fairly shortly. But I want to go over those 3 fallacies again one more time, just so everybody's clear on them. So the settled question fallacy, if I can summarize that, would be, and tell me if this sounds right, would be basically that whatever the perspective is, that it's certain, that it's settled. There's no more need for debates or questioning. It's settled.
And if you think differently, I mean, the implication of that is that if you think differently, if I think it's settled and you think something else, then I think you're denying reality. It's not that you have a different viewpoint, you're denying reality.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you're not only is it certain, but if you're not certain about it too, then you're denying reality, or you're malicious in some way.
Right.
Something like, yeah. The known intent fallacy, that essentially attributing intent to what people, however it impacted me, that's what you intended. Is that what that is?
Yeah, I mean, the fallacy of known intent is just, is that, like, so somebody has some opinion that I find objectionable, and I can tell everything I need to know about their intent, or that, intent is irrelevant. That would be sort of the extreme version of that. But, so assuming that I know, by knowing the person's opinion about, take the example I said earlier, I think that trans women shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's category sports. Again, just channeling an argument, that I know everything I need to know about the person's intent. That would be the fallacy.
Right. So essentially you're attributing intent, and that kind of implies their character.
Yep.
So, okay.
Yep.
And then the final one, the equal knowledge fallacy, that you must have the same amount of knowledge I have, and yet you're making a different perspective.
Yeah, the fallacy is this idea that if the person doesn't agree with me because they're ignorant, or they just don't agree with me because they just don't know. And again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't educate themselves or that they shouldn't have more information. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, and again, think of the sort of version that I said at the end, which is that if we all had the same information when it comes to controversial issues, particularly these kinds of issues around identity, fairness, intent, equality, et cetera, racism, would we all agree? And and again, like when you frame it, so go back to that question, and the answer is obviously no.
Yeah.
Right.
So if you're just becoming aware of all these fallacies, that I'm assuming just kind of keeping those in mind, not only it helps people stay in a curious mindset, not be so certain in what they believe, not be so certain that the other person was intending to do what they think they're intending to do, or that they have the same exact knowledge, or that just because they have the same exact knowledge means that they're going to make the same decisions. So just being aware of all that seems like a very important step.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's one question in the comments.
Yeah, I was interested in the comments about we're being pulled backwards now, and what that means more, please, especially if we're virtual, and what that means in the context of, so being pulled back.
I think what I meant, I think what Susan's comments referring to, I think, was when I was saying that we tend to sort of err more on the side of trying to protect people and protect groups, which, again, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm saying that it can become too constrictive. It can become, as a default mechanism, it can become constrictive. I'm not sure. I think that's what she was, and I'm not sure about being virtual and what this means. I mean, I think that the implications are pretty similar if it's virtual or in person. I guess maybe it's in some ways easy if you're virtual because there are just the number of interactions, maybe fewer. So there's just overall just a smaller number of interactions that are happening, but I'm not.
Yeah, I wasn't clear on the question, but if that answered it,
Yeah.
great. If not, and please send another clarifying question. Yeah, so so let me, I had just one other question that I wanted to ask you. It was more about sort of some of the extreme examples and if extremity shows up. Like if we want to create an inclusive culture, let's say, or we want to create a culture where there's diversity of thoughts, like I guess maybe you answered this already. How do we draw the borderlines around how far wide we're allowed to go inclusive? Because if someone brings in like, oh, all of a sudden we realize there's a Nazi in our midst, something who just wants to like bring in real hate or something like that. We're, you know, do you think that that's just implied in places like, okay, that's just going to be obviously not okay? Or do you think that we need to create some like very explicit structure around what's allowed and what's not?
You know, you mean in terms of what people do in their time outside of work versus what they do at work?
No, because someone, I remember coming across a case where someone put in a message board that was, it was an inclusive, it was an internal message board. There's thousands of employees in this company. It's an internal message board. And someone said something, I think it was like sort of what might be like considered a homophobic comment.
Yeah.
Something, and it was, and I read it, and it was obviously not okay, you know?
Yeah.
And the person got fired, and there was, and the person who it was directed towards, you know, was obviously very hurt by it, and there was a lot of reconciliation at it, and stuff like that. And so, like, that seems implied that wouldn't be okay. But if you're trying to create a viewpoint diverse culture, do you think would it be important to create some very explicit?
I absolutely. I think so, in the sense that, I mean, one of the things I think I said early on with, oh, there's my cat. Sorry. She just jumped right up. I think that I do think that it's important to make that explicit in the sense of, look, everybody gets treated with dignity and respect, full stop. And so that, whatever that homophobic comment was, that's a norm violation, or maybe even something more than a norm violation, right? Like that's because that's part of it, right? Is that everybody gets treated with dignity and respect, full stop.
Yeah.
Right. This is our starting point. So I think that would preclude, or that would give an organization space to say, no, that thing, whatever it was not okay.
Right. Right. I mean, and then it's interesting when you get into these ideas, because they become a little bit abstract, because you could say, you know, someone could say, oh, well, this person said this to me. It was, I can't remember, something that's like seems benign, but they took offense to it. That was not treating me with dignity and respect, and that's part of our culture. It's like, how do we determine now what's within the realm of dignity?
You go to your goal. You go to your North Star. Like in those ambiguous situations, like, you know, and I mean, you'd also have to factor in other things, like, you know, how the person who said the thing, like, what was the thing that, like, I'll give you an example. So what was the thing? Had they been, you know, is this the 15th time that they've said something offensive? And what is the thing that they said? Like, so for example, you know, I worked with an organization once where there was a group of people who were really offended by the use of the word healthy. I don't think they were lying about it. I think they were honestly they felt like it was normative about body size and diet and lifestyle in a way that made them uncomfortable. And so, okay, so do you want to, most workplaces would say, okay, well, that's okay. We're not going to tell everyone they can't use the word healthy, right? Like that's just taking it a little bit too far. But what are you going to do? Right? Like, and let's say that the person says it again. let's say the person said, right? So like, there's no magic answer with that stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I think it would be, was the person trying deliberately to taunt the other person? Like, was it, what was the context and what was being said? Like, were they, because you also don't want to give people a free pass to sort of bend and subvert norms in a way that, like, I mean, I have kids and they're like, well, I didn't mean to say it. I was just saying, did it, this kind of thing. And so you want to, you really are going to have to take those things, I think, largely to the extent that you can, on a case-by-case basis, because what alternative do you have?
What alternative do you have? Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, really, like, what alternative do you have? Because the alternative is that you're either going to condemn all of them, which is going to lead to the eggshell walking, or you're going to do nothing, which is going to lead to, I don't know what, is the sort of roughshod environment, right? Like, and so I don't know what choice you have other than to sort of take those interactions as they come.
Well, maybe another North Star in terms of like let's say, hey, we want people to be feel included and belong here, and that's cool. Maybe another North Star, and this is something that I've talked about in certain trainings, is having a culture where you give the benefit of the doubt to your coworkers and you don't just assume malicious intent.
Right. This is the principle of charity, and sort of why would you do that, right? Why would you want to do that? And there are it turns out there are actually really important reasons why you would want to do that, why you want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And I know we're sort of running out of time, but I think that you're totally right. I think the reason that you would do that is because of the culture that you want to create. The reason giving people the benefit of the doubt is tied to that goal.
Well, and especially when we're talking about changing language, like for instance, someone says, hey, we think the word healthy is offensive. And you've got a bunch of people who use the word healthy on a regular basis. And if you say all of a sudden healthy is not okay, and they say healthy because it's just part of their natural language, not to assume, oh, see, this person's trying to offend me, they don't care about me, etc. Like, you've changed language on them. It's the same thing with, changing from he, she to they, them, and that kind of thing. It's like there's older 65-year-old, 70-year-old man who's working at the place. All of a sudden, his whole life he's using he, she pronouns. All of a sudden, he's got to start changing them, or else he's being offensive. It's like you got to give him the benefit of the doubt. This is a major shift in vocabulary, and maybe he won't get it ever totally right.
Yeah, I think I'm right. I think it's all right. The context matters.
Oh, let me see. Does the extreme version of known intent is that issues viewed as they pertain to themselves as individuals and the team member? Can a closed circuit?
I'm not sure I understand those questions.
I'm not sure I understand.
Okay. That's all right.
Yeah. No,
this has been good, Jeremy.
Yeah, I think I think we've got a few good points here, and I love these three fallacies. I think these are really important to keep in mind in terms of remaining curious and having a conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Tell people how they can find out more about you.
Diverseperspectivesconsulting.com. Everything you need to know is there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ilana. It was great to see you. Great to talk to you.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much.
Talk soon. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.